It's 5:31, so I'm gonna just say a few words to introduce our speakers today. So Joachim de Weerdt and Luc Christiaensen, they're gonna present a joint work with Ravi Kanbur. Joachim has made wonderful contributions to the literature on the nexus between migration and development, something that we will also hear about today. For a long number of years, he has been living and working in Africa, and a lot of his research is based on data that he has himself collected. So we are really glad to have both of you on board with us today. Joachim, the floor is yours, as I said, for around 45 minutes.
Thank you very much. So thanks, Simone, for this great introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here today. So I'm here together with Luc, my co-author. And unfortunately, Ravi couldn't be here. He had another engagement. So really, the motivation for this work is that internal migration is an important avenue for growth and poverty reduction in developing countries. And I know, like, many of the people here have looked at international migration. So what's true for international migration is also true for internal migration, that it's an important route out of poverty for both those who move internally within their own countries and also for the people who remain at home, the family members who remain at home. And so that physical mobility fosters growth is very clear, but we don't know so much about where people are moving to. So this paper is really about the where rather than the first question. And so, and I guess it's also becoming clear that there are important spatial differences within developing countries. So, for example, we knew already for a long time that urban areas are wealthier than rural areas, but recently more papers have been highlighting that also wealth increases with city size. So larger cities being wealthier than smaller cities. And so I guess even more than the people looking at international migration, people looking at internal migration are kind of even more puzzled by the fact of why doesn't internal migration equalize these differences? I mean, with international migration, the answer, I guess, is quite obvious that there are important barriers in place. But what about internal migration? Why is there no equilibrium achieved through migration here? And so one answer potentially is that there is sort of a spatial equilibrium going on in which sort of if in one dimension perhaps there is say that you're wondering why people are not moving to urban areas, perhaps urban areas in one dimension are in terms of wages are better, but in terms of other dimensions they perform worse, for example in terms of crime or pollution, etc. I think a lot of the debate has been actually about whether it's related to frictions or whether it's related to selection. So another way of thinking about it is that there are frictions, that people are not moving because something's holding them back. And another sort of opposed to that view is that there is selection going on with a higher ability people moving to the richer places. And so that's actually the reason why you see these differences. So that has nothing to do with the place per se, but it all has to do with the people who are there. Okay, so this puzzle really is completely relevant within the Kagera migrant panel, which is the panel that we will be looking at today. We've shown in previous papers that migration is really profitable, but that very few people migrate. And we've also shown that the moves to the big cities are more lucrative than moves to the smaller towns or moves to the rural areas. Still very few people seem to make them. And so what we really want to do in this paper is address the question, why is that? And to understand why, it's clear that we need to understand how migrants choose their destinations and why so many end up from the rural to urban migrants, why so many end up in these towns instead of in the cities. And the big thing that's going to, that we think is coming out of all of this work is that distance is playing a key role here, and we need to give give it more attention. Okay, so let's look at the data. The data come from the Kagera region here. This is, I guess you can see this when I'm showing my cursor, right? Yeah. So this is the Kagera region in Tanzania, tucked in between Lake Victoria, Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. It's also the place where I've lived for 12 years. And one of the things that kept me there was a panel of households, which was first collected. Baseline was done in 91, 94. I had very little to do with that survey at the time, but then 6,353 individuals who were representative of the region were interviewed. And in 2010, 2004 and 2010, we actually did follow-up surveys where we tried to track every single household member from that baseline survey. So we interviewed people who had split up from the original household, but we also interviewed people who'd moved out of the region or the village where they were living. So here's the baseline panel in 91, 94. So that's about 18 years before the follow-up. And people were in 51 villages, clustered in 51 villages and 915 households, together representative of the region. So if you fast forward now to 2010, 18 years later, you can see the extent to which internal migration is happening in a place like that. Essentially, the whole of the Kagera region, and here we're just zoomed into the Kagera region, people have moved into from these original 51 villages. And the main areas where you don't see any red dots are actually game reserves and uninhabitable areas because there are big swamps, etc. So that gives you a sense of the extent to which that migration, that internal migration is happening. We've also got migration further afield. So both in Tanzania, you have people moving out of the region and going into other locations within Tanzania. And then in terms of cities, it's good to point out there's Dar es Salaam here, which is the main city, the biggest city, even if it's not the capital city per se, it's the commercial hub. And then you've got Mwanza here, which is a city on the shores of Lake Victoria, which is also important, especially for the Kagera region. Okay, so one of the things that's nice about working with KHDS is that the recontact rates are quite high. So in terms of finding households, I think we found about 92% of households, but we're actually looking at individuals here. So the relevant recontact rates would be expressed in terms of how many individuals we found. And here you see that we didn't find 12% of the individuals those were untraced. Then about 20% had died, but we have some information on the circumstances of their death, and 68% were re-interviewed, so 88% accounted for. So this is sort of the thing that we've been highlighting in this panel in my work with Lucan and Ravi, is that if you split the migrants, now let's just concentrate on the migrants. So these are 2,000 migrants that we're looking at here. And we look at, and we split them up into where these migrants are going to, whether they're going to rural areas, to towns, or to cities. Then we see that in terms of their baseline outcomes, there's relatively little difference. I mean, the people who end up in cities are a little bit richer, not much richer than those going to towns, and a little bit richer than the ones going to the rural areas. But if you go to 2010, then those differences really become enormous. And here, this is just to give you an idea of the change in those averages. So people moving to cities really have an enormous amount of welfare gain compared to people moving to towns. And perhaps I should mention that this is all expressed in consumption per capita. And there was a price questionnaire included in the survey, which we used to spatially and temporally deflate the prices. So this is these are comparable consumption data that we're looking at here. So these are the figures that people often look at and see, like, and often motivate then definitely within policy circles a focus on cities, because that's where a lot of the economic action seems to be happening. Some of our work, we've been trying to highlight not just that we shouldn't just be looking at these changes in consumption or average consumption for that matter, but that we should be looking at the N. Actually, very few people end up in the cities, and many more people end up in towns, and even more people end up in the rural areas. So that if you put these two things together, sort of in a purely accounting way, although there are many people who make the people who make these moves to the cities have a lot of economic benefits to that move, there's actually very few people who make them, so that the total contribution of these people and the total growth that was realized by the sample is actually much smaller than the group of the town, the people who moved to towns. Their contribution was a little bit more modest. They didn't grow as much, but because there are so many more of them, actually their total share, in this accounting view, is actually much larger than the people who moved to the cities. And we can do that also for poverty, for example. Then you can see that poverty, people moving to cities, there's very little difference, especially between those who move to towns and move to cities at baseline. But then essentially poverty gets completely reduced practically to zero for the people who move to the cities, while it still remains at 14% for those who move to towns. And then again, you can see if you decompose the total amount of poverty reduction in terms of headcount poverty reduction in the sample, which was there, which was substantial over that 18-year period, you see that the contribution of those people moving to cities, without taking into account any kind of general equilibrium effects that they might have had, is much smaller than the people who move to towns. So clearly there's a lot of action going on in terms of urbanization, in terms of what urbanization means for growth and what urbanization means for poverty reduction. There's a lot of action going on in these towns, and they definitely merit a lot of attention, which they haven't been getting so far. This is another way of showing this. These are CDFs, cumulative distribution functions, for the baseline here between the people who will be moving to a village and who will be moving to a town or a city at the bottom here. And you can see that the people moving, especially the ones between the people who move to towns and cities, the differences are rather small at baseline, but they really become much bigger once you move to, once you fast forward to 18 years later. Okay, so that's the first data set that we'll be using here. And then the second data set is the census data set. That's the long form census data on 3.7 million individuals. So, and that's available through EPUMS. And the good thing about this long form data set is that it includes information on assets and amenities, and we can combine that into a single wealth index for all the different locations that our migrants have moved to within the country. And so one thing that I want to point out here is that, first of all, you see this gradient again with wealth much lower in rural areas, much higher in towns, and then higher again in cities. That's clear from the census as well, just as it was from the KHDS. But something that's quite striking is if you look at the 10th percentile, so the poorest people, the poorest 10% in a city, their wealth index is 0.33, while the 90th percentile in the rural areas is 0.29. So it means that the 10th percentile in the city is actually richer than the 90th percentile in the rural areas, at least by this metric, by using the asset index. And so one thing that we've done, and this is actually part of another paper that we've written, but with the same group of authors, with Luca and Ravi, is that we've sort of looked at the implications of that finding in terms of the Harris-Todaro model, the core Harris-Todaro model, where you've got a risk-neutral agent in a rural area having wage WR, needing to choose between going to an urban area and getting a formal job at W or an informal job at W0. Okay, and so in the original formulation of the Harris-Todaro model, the unemployment rate equalizes, which is the unemployment rate, meaning like the chance of ending up in W0 is the equalizing or the adjusting variable here. So that means that this WR is for this risk neutral agent is a weighted average of W and W0. Now, obviously, we've already seen that actually this WR is lower than both the W and the W0. So we're clearly not in this kind of world. And actually, if you look at the CDFs also of the, because for the Kagera migrants specifically, we know whether they're in an informal or a formal job in those cities, and you can see that the distribution of both the people who end up in these rural, in the informal sector in the cities, and the people who end up in the formal sector in the city, both of these distributions dominate the distribution of the people who end up in the rural areas. Okay, so what we do in that other paper is that we mention that one way, I mean, obviously this could be selection, but another way of thinking about this is that there are moving costs actually related to each of these locations, and that by introducing these moving costs, if you've got the WR and W0 and W here, by introducing these moving costs, we actually bring down that distribution of the destination wages, and we can make the model consistent again with Harris-Todaro, even without introducing these selection effects. Okay, so that's what we do there. And actually, the reason I'm presenting this also is that's also going to be part of the way we're going to be looking at destination choice. So we're going to be looking at the relative importance of wages and moving costs at the different destinations. Okay. We'll do this through a dyadic setup. So the dyadic setup essentially implies that so we have 78 destinations that our migrants went to, which we can identify from the census, which means that every one of our migrants chose to move to one location, but that also means that they chose not to move to 77 other locations. So what we do is we make all the pairwise combinations of the 2012 migrants in the sample. We pair them with each of the 78 destinations. So we get a data set of 2012 times 78 observations. And then we populate that data set with the following variables. On the left-hand side, we have destination choice, which is what we're trying to explain. And then on the right-hand side, we have migrant characteristics. We have destination characteristics. And we have the migrant destination relational variables. So the migrant characteristics might be age and poverty status, etc. Destination characteristics will mainly be interested in destination wealth. And the migrant destination relational variables, that is something that's specific to the dyad in question. For example, how far the destination is from that specific individual, which differs obviously depending on the combination of individual and destination. But it could be that migrant destination relational variable could also be an interaction between a destination characteristic and a migrant characteristic. And so this kind of way of looking at the correlates of destination choice, that's something that has been done before, and specifically by Fafchan and Shilpi in a paper published in 2013. So for this model, we're especially interested in looking at the different components of that multiple destination Harris-Todaro model that we developed in the separate paper. So we'll be looking specifically, yeah, Simone?
Do you also have variables related to the household of origin of the migrant, or you really cast these as an individual level decision? Whether to move and when to move?
Yeah, some of the variables we'll be looking at are actually household level variables. So we'll be looking at things like wealth, etc., which are at the household level. I think, but to answer perhaps where you're going with your question is whether we're looking at this as a household decision or an individual decision. And I think, although we're not very specific about this in the paper, but we are doing the whole analysis at individual levels. So I think we're thinking about this as in that context, we're setting it up as an individual level choice. With perhaps some household level variables that are coming into the analysis.
Okay.
So we're especially interested in the wealth levels at destination, which we'll get from the census, and we're interested in the moving costs, which we proxy by distance. And so the regression setup and then is the following. We've got YID is 1 if individual I migrated to destination D, and it's 0 otherwise. And then you've got DD, which are the characteristics of the destination area, RID, the relational variables, and then alpha I, we're just going to include an individual fixed effect because we've got multiple observations per individual to control for individual level variables. And then got an error term. And then the standard errors are clustered by the 51 baseline communities because they were the primary sampling unit in the original survey. So what we get is, Chala, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Two things. I mean, I'm not really familiar with Tanzania at all. Are there linguistic issues depending on which village you come from, which region you go to? Is there a way to I don't know if there's a way to control for that.
So that's a very good question. Actually, in principle, there is a common language in Tanzania, which is Swahili, and everybody speaks it, and everybody learns at school how to speak Swahili. But there is, in our qualitative work, one of the things that came up was not particularly not knowing Swahili per se, but perhaps not feeling comfortable when you come out of the village speaking like the kind of people know that you've been growing up in a village and you don't speak the kind of town Swahili that everybody else speaks. There is some of that going on as a potential barrier to migration. It's quite subtle though. So all of our migrants will know Swahili. So it came out of the qualitative work, but I don't think that if we would include like any kind of variable for ethnicity or ethnic background, it would come up as very strongly relevant here.
So following up on that, then, is there some sort of I mean, especially for a lot of the, let's say, informally employed or really low skill, uneducated people, social networks are important. Is there a way, since you have a panel, to control where people from your village, did they go to a specific area, kind of measure of social capital to control for that?
Yeah, well, that's one thing that potentially we could do. What we're going to argue is actually that our distance variable will be capturing part of that, because I mean, essentially where I'm going is that I want to argue that distance is important, but obviously distance in itself doesn't really exist. It's a combination of all kinds of other factors, and potentially networks are one of the things that are important in distance. Definitely, the further away you are, the less networks that you will have. So that could potentially be a factor here.
And then if you can indulge me, I have one last question.
Yeah, no.
So you have a time dimension here, but I don't see how it exactly, because you have the individual fixed effect, because this is an individual panel. So then how are you measuring migration? If the person migrated in the last period, or they ever migrated, or how is the mobility exactly measured? Because you can have like a multiple migration episodes.
Ah, right. Yes. And
so you go to the small town first, and then you go to the bigger town, you end up in the big city. Do you see what I mean?
I do. And we also read your paper on that in the context of international migration, which I think is extremely relevant here. And I think there is something like that going on. again, it came out strongly out of our qualitative work, and running ahead, it's clear that these moves to these small towns are extremely important in terms of opening up migration opportunities further afield. So that move to somewhere close by, if you've got a small town very close by, that's actually a very easy move for a migrant to make. But it's an enormously transformative move because it actually puts them in touch with a whole wider network of people who come together there, with people who are not from their village, who do speak that other kind of Swahili. Opening up networks, opening up ideas, etc. So that
or saving money so you can make the bigger move if you have credit constraints.
Exactly. Yeah, building up human capital as well in terms of learning a skill, perhaps even if it's just carrying bricks on a construction site, they learn some of the skills there, which can be useful then in other places. So that's definitely an extremely important part. I'm actually going to discuss this. I think there's a note in like further research, interesting research on this. So it's not actually part of this paper, but it's an extremely important part of the migration story in this context.
Okay, so I'll stop now.
Yeah.
Joachim, quick clarification question.
Hi, Karen.
Look, me have answered it, but so you're only using the last round of data?
Yes, that's what I wanted to say. Yes, actually, that's the short answer to Chalar's question. Is that we're only using their last round of data. We won't be looking at different migration episodes, essentially because we didn't do very well in terms of collecting those. We know where people were in 2004, we know where they were in 2010, but we don't have a full migration roster of all the hops that they made, which is something that if we ever go back to these people, we will be definitely doing, because I think there's a lot of...
but if this is a cross-section, how do you have individual fixed effects?
Well, the individual fixed effects are there because they are because we've got 78 observations per person, and so we include a dummy for each of the people there. But we're not. What I want to stress that the individual fixed effect, that we are not dealing with selection through these individual fixed effects.
But
so
wouldn't that be easier than to run? This is you're running like a kind of OLS, or is it a
no PM?
Yeah, why not run a kind of a discrete choice model, like a linear model, where right? And you don't have to have the individual fixed effects, but all the other things, and you can look at the marginal impact that way as well. I think that.
Yeah, I think you mean running a logit or a probit?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, it's your call, or even a nested model.
Yeah, we could have done that. I think generally trying to keep these things simple because there are an enormous amount of observations here. Yeah. So
but that's arising from because you include 77 choices that are not picked. So, and then I'm assuming you don't include in the sample the non-migrants. That way, if you run a discrete choice model, you can include them in the sample as well, which would give you additional information.
You mean to do a nested model to have
exactly.
Two different,
first,
yes,
exactly.
Maybe I should have explained that. Like this is actually it's a relevant point. We're taking away that first step, and we're actually only looking at the migrants. So we're not looking at the correlates of whether you want to migrate, yes or no. We've done that work in other papers. Here, we're very specifically interested in within the migrants, who is going to choose which migration destination. So
I mean, I think I actually was convinced you were estimating a conditional budget the way you set this up. This is exactly why we have those things. And then that would allow you indeed, I agree with the previous point, and you can make it a nested decision, which is not two separate decisions. It's not true that you first decide to migrate and then will you migrate too. These are joint decisions, and that's exactly why we have nested logics. I know we don't do these very often anymore these days, but the decision problem you're trying to model, I think, is exactly right.
Because my worry would be, as Karen said, not including, it might create some sort of a selection bias, right? In your estimation, you're basically estimating the second stage of a conditional model. And not controlling for the first stage, I don't know if it would introduce biases.
Yeah, I'm just not sure which variables would distinguish the choice to migrate versus the choice of where to migrate.
Well, half the papers in migration are about, figuring out the, the fact, those things, unfortunately. Yeah. Anyway, I took too much of your time.
I would want to come in here. I think actually using the fixed effects, the individual fixed effects adds a lot of value. Because basically, first of all, there is a difference choosing one or the other. They're different because of distance. So you say, look, I choose 79 observations I don't choose, but these 79 observations have characteristics. They have different wealth and they are different distance. So each time the individual characteristics, the unobserved individual characteristics remain the same, and you make that choice when you decide to move between these 78 destinations. It's very similar like in the agricultural literature where you look at yields and you have yields at plot level and you control for household fixed effects, because the same household, all the unobserved household effects, the same household chooses to plant or to put fertilizer on one plot versus the other, and they have a number of plots. So you don't necessarily need to observe all these household effects. So in this case, you don't need to observe the individual fixed effects, the individual unobserved effects, because you control for them by, they choose between 80 or 78 observations. So I think actually this way is quite powerful to do that.
Look, but that is exactly what you do with the conditional logic. You have de facto a fixed effect. You estimate it.
But if you can do it this way, why would you go there, even with the conditional logic?
Because the distribution of error.
Sorry?
Because the distribution of your error terms is much more like what you would have in a conditional logic model. Anyway, we don't have to kind of stick to this.
Yeah, but it's an important point. I would want to come back to it.
You should. Sorry, I didn't want to step in too far. We don't need to, like, this is, one can debate this forever, but I think it's worth looking into it, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so here's our linear probability model to be clear on what we're doing, with 2010 location being the so everybody was living in a rural area in baseline, and now we are trying to explain which area they moved to among the people who moved. So we're not looking at the choice of whether they migrated or not. We've isolated the choice of where to migrate to, conditional on having already made the decision to migrate. Okay, and then what we see is that you've got a negative effect of distance, okay, and a positive effect of wealth. So the distance deters. So the further away, the less likely you are to choose that location. The richer the location, the more likely you are to choose that location. So the question is sort of what's more important, and it's kind of hard. But one way to think about that would be to look at whether in terms of standard deviations, you can pick up a difference there, and then that is quite substantial, where we actually see that if you need to increase distance, you'd need to, if the distance goes up by 1 standard deviation, you'd need to increase wealth by about 5.5 standard deviations, I think it is, to offset a 1 standard deviation increase in distance. So if seen like that, distance is actually an extremely important variable in this relationship. Okay, so the other thing that we can do is then look at whether certain groups of people are more or less, whether there are interaction effects with distance and wealth. And we see that, especially for poverty, so this is just a dummy, are you under the poverty line, yes or no? You can see that for poverty, there is a much larger deterrent effect of distance for the poor, and that there's a much lower deterrent effect of distance for people with schooling, which you can see here. So I think at about some years of post-secondary education, which is relatively rare in this sample, would there be no effect anymore of distance on your propensity to migrate? Okay, so then in terms of wealth, you see the opposite happening. Actually, the poor being less likely, there's a lesser pull effect of wealth for the poor, and for the people with more years of education, the pull effect of wealth is actually much higher. So these are sort of interaction effects that make a lot of sense. And we have also for age, you can see that the younger you are, the higher, the more important the wealth effect is, and no significant effect for distance. I think we said all that. And then what's also interesting is if you actually, if you interacted with the type of destination, then you see that urban destinations are actually much less likely to be chosen than rural destinations, but that the distance effect is less important for those who choose urban destination. And that potentially has something to do with sort of the anonymous or the less anonymous and less thick markets that are present in rural areas compared to urban areas. Okay, so we could also isolate and take out, so construct the dyads differently. Now what we did is we took all the migrants and we linked them to any possible destination choice, but now we can take all the urban migrants and link them to all the possible urban destination choices. Because remember, we're particularly interested in this question of why do people move to towns and not to cities. So that would be the most relevant sort of set of people to look at, the people who are going to urban areas, and some of them have gone to cities and some of them have gone to towns. And then you can see again these same patterns arising, perhaps as noted before, that distance is less important for people moving to urban areas, but still in terms of, if you would express it as a standard error, still 1.6 times more important than wealth. So still dominating that relationship, but very similar interaction effects here. Okay, so if we now put all of this together and we take that last table that I showed you, and we try to think about the pull effects, like what the relative, so we know that cities and towns differ in terms of wealth, and we know that they differ in terms of distance. Towns on average are much closer because there are many more of them in the country. Cities are further away on average for a rural migrant because there are fewer of them. So in a purely geographical way, towns will always be much closer if there are more of them. The wealth we know is much higher in the cities than it is in the towns. So if we take that difference in distance for each person to the nearest town, and we also look at the differences between wealth between cities and towns, then we can look at how much higher the likelihood is of a certain migrant ending up in a town compared to ending up in a city. And we see that's 8.5 percentage points higher for the average individual in our sample, that they're, because of the effect of distance, 8.5 percentage points more likely to end up in a town compared to a city. The wealth effect obviously has the opposite effect. It actually pulls people to the city. So they're less likely to move to a town and more likely to a city. And so they're 2.6 percentage points less likely to end up in a town compared to a city because of the wealth differences between towns and cities. And combining those two effects, sort of our horse race between distance and wealth. And we see that there's a clear effect where distance actually dominates wealth in terms of and that's potentially also a reason, or that's what we think is why people end up in towns compared to cities. Now, there's an important effect of these interaction variables as well. So especially, for example, with people with no education, the distance effect is extremely important. So that distance, they're 16.3 percentage point more likely to end up in a town compared to a city, while the wealth effect is actually much attenuated for these people. So the pull effect of wealth is much less. So that in total, there's much more likelihood of these people ending up in towns. And as you go across the education gradient, the deterrent effect of distance diminishes. And by the time you get to higher secondary education, it's become a fraction only of what it was for the people with no education. And in the meantime, also you see that wealth effect actually going up and up and up, or favoring cities, so that in total for the people with higher education, that preference for towns actually disappears. And there's a slight preference for cities for people of that nature. Okay, so we have a long discussion section in the paper where we try and frame these findings in terms of the rise of towns in Africa. And so here's a data set from Africa Polis, which uses a harmonized spatial definition of urban areas using demographic data and satellite data and aerial images, etc. And it just looks for continuously built up areas and then identifies places where population is over 10,000 people. And one of the key features here is the enormous amount, just the sheer amount of towns arising in Africa, going from 1950, there are 624, and by 2015, there are 7,617. Okay, and so if you look in terms of population, and this is often sort of the narrative is often about the rise of the cities, which is kind of true in terms of the share of population, because if you look at from 1950 to 2015, the share of people, the share of the urban population living in a center of over 1 million people has gone up from 13 to 40%. Those in small towns has gone down a little bit. Okay, but if you think about it spatially, the story is very different. You used to have 2 cities of over 1 million in 1950, and that's gone up to 74 now. Quite impressive, but it's still only 74 dots on that map, right? But think about how many dots this represents. All of these 574, there were 574 small towns, which has gone up to 6,899 in 2015. So spatially, that rise of the small towns is much more important than the rise of the cities. And so because these towns are on the rise all over Africa, and every new town decreases the distance between the average rural dweller and the nearest urban location, and because we think that this distance is a really important component of migration frictions, we think that the rise of the small town is going to open up a lot of migration opportunities to these small towns. But then, as Chalar pointed out, also beyond these small towns, because the conditions that held them back previously to be living in the village are actually changing, and it's opening up more opportunities. So, and obviously we're just looking at migration here, but there's lots of other channels through which similar effects are going to be taking place. If you think about the flows, not just of people, but also of information and of capital and of goods and services that are potentially flowing between these small towns and the rural areas. So the birth and then the rise of these new towns is really greasing the wheels of the structural transformation process in as much as it's also, part and parcel of the structural transformation process. And so in terms of policy, we think that this is a very strong evidence that, or at least contributes to the body of evidence that tries to argue that we need to strengthen the role of these small and intermediate towns, very much aligned with the new urban agenda. And just a statistic, 80% of the extreme poor in rural areas, probably most of you knew that already, but what is also interesting is to see where they live and how they gravitate around the urban areas. They don't gravitate around the cities, they gravitate around the towns. So globally, 28% of rural populations lives within 1 hour of travel from a city of over 1 million, but in low-income countries, that's only 7%, but 43% of the rural population in low-income countries does live with a 1 hour travel from a town of 250K, and another 20% within 2 hours. Okay, so in terms of future work, it's obviously like, I mentioned this before, distance isn't a thing in itself. It can be unpacked into different, is it about social ties? Is it social cultural affinity? Is it about the language? Is it about transport or just raw transport costs? Or is it about keeping return options open? There's also this thing the nearby town is an enabler of the first move that we talked about previously in the discussion with Chalar. And then, just beyond migration, that we need to start understanding better this evolving role of towns in the structural transformation process. I think that's going to be important to advise on policies to make sure that urbanization process is also enhances development in both the rural and the urban areas. So thank you, and
thanks a lot.
Floor open to questions.
Thanks a lot. So we still have time for questions. Do not hesitate to submit a written question or just unmute. We'll start with two, and then I give the floor to Chalar. So the first question is, to what extent should we be concerned that this is partly a product of the fact that attrition is more likely if you move further away, so that it's more difficult to track you? And the second is, to what extent, I'm going back to the household issue, to what extent this is split couple migration, and in some sense, short distance move can be attractive because you can more easily monitor the spouse left behind, in the spirit of the LAT on JD 2014.
Yeah. Shall I? Attrition further away, I'd need to think about how that would play. I think I could, it's a good question, and I think we actually have some data on that, which I should get, because we do know for some of the people that we try to track whether we got them or not, and where their probable residence was. So I could actually look at that, but I can't give you an answer off the top of my head. In terms of split couple migration, our migrants have, most of them, they used to be living in town with their parents, but remember, we're talking about 18 years here. So a lot of this is people who used to be children living with their parents and have now moved on and formed their own households and are living, have started living their lives independently. So that's sort of the typical household here. So we identify somebody as, we identify a household and then all the individuals living in it. We're not really talking about people who move out temporarily and are actually still attached to a household. That's not the typical thing that we're looking at here. Actually, these people would, even in the context of our survey, be counted as part of whatever household they're part of. So we're really talking about migration where you set up in a different location and don't come, and not temporary migration. In terms of distance, something that we've heard quite a lot, which makes me think about this split couple thing, is like, yes, I want to go far from my family, not particularly for control, but more for sort of the social pressure that can be attached. What people told us is that we want to be far away enough so that people from the village can't reach us within 1 day walking, but not so far that it's very costly for us to come back. So that's, again, like quite informal from the focus group discussions that we did in these areas. But so far enough to not have all the social obligations, but not too far that it becomes costly to come back.
Chalar?
I was going to say that's exactly how I felt regarding my in-laws in terms of optimal distance. But I was fascinated with the population figures we showed about the emergence of all these thousands of towns. Is there a way to see? Yeah, that's a fantastic figure. I don't think you see it anywhere else in the world to that extent. So my question is there a way to see, like especially these small towns, what percentage of the new population, quote unquote, is there a way to figure out are migrants versus, kind of an organic growth. No, same thing with the big cities, right? I think because there's an endogenous process here, right? Migration leads to the emergence of these towns, and the towns attract migrants. So any kind of analysis needs to control for that self-reinforcing process. Yeah.
So you've got the natural city growth, you've got the migration, and then you've got a lot of this is in situ urbanization. So a village that was previously very rural in nature suddenly taking on more and more urban characteristics and growing and then turning into an urban area. And I think that perhaps Luc knows this off the top of his head, but I think there was a surprising, what surprised me is how much was due to actually natural urban growth, actually relatively little, at least compared to sort of the narrative that you hear out there, is actually caused by migration.
Okay, because that's fantastic. I mean, it might also be healthcare is superior there, so larger share of the children survive, or you have even more children. Like your fertility decision is linked to your migration decision. Like the parents are migrants, but the children are born there. And but that's a fantastic figure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Are there other questions?
Yeah, actually, this is definitely in Africa. It's the case that more of the growth, urban growth, comes from natural increase, and increasingly so as urbanization takes hold. A couple of recent papers which go through that in detail. So along the lines which Joachim is pointing out. Now, I think it also depends a bit on the towns. So what you will have there, I think, is sort of this rural densification in a way. And so villages reclassified as towns, and then some of these villages in the neighborhood of secondary cities with sort of the agglomeration kind of absorbing them in a way. But by and large, migration plays a smaller role in African urban growth than what you observe in other continents. We just finalized the study actually on that for Africa.
Okay, so we have reached 6:31 p.m. I would like to thank Joachim and Luc for sharing their work with us today and for being online with us. Thanks a lot to all of you for being online with us, and see you next week for the last seminar before a long 3-month summer break. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome.
Bye. Thanks.